Hi, everybody. I've been watching Medtech about this much less than Mike Berman has. So I need panelists. Do we have panelists? I can moderate. I can tell you about the stock market if you want. Here we go. Hi. So one thing while we're getting gathered here that we want to do is, first off, this is going to be about taking some of the things that Steve was talking about as far as what's going on in the future and how we're going to do this, and a lot of what we spent the morning and early afternoon talking about, and that is the merger of what, information technology with med technology. So this is going to be another discussion of that, but I've done a lot of healthcare conferences in my career, but I have to admit, this is a stellar. We have GE, Intel, Qualcomm, and West Wireless here, and this is, to me, I was excited and volunteered to moderate this because I think this is the future. Remember, I'm the stock market. Long-term thinking for me is what's going to happen on Monday kind of thing. But when you think out to what's going to happen over the next 5 years, over the next 10 years, and how Intel has a health group, Qualcomm has a health group, Microsoft has these guys have health groups. Do the Medtechs have IT tech for the future groups? So we have to think about that and how we're going to merge it. It's the chip that went inside of a pacemaker 15, 20 years ago was maybe 2 to 3 years behind the cutting edge chips. Now I think the distance has lengthened here, and Medtech's going to need to catch up what they're doing with their devices to get into the information and technology group. So we're going to do this in two parts. Number one is introduce a group of people that I think have been working a long time in healthcare, but maybe not as familiar to you. And then second, we're going to give it to you to do the Q&A. And think about it. I'm going out in the audience. We're going to make this interactive and find out what we can from the big brains in technology. So with that, who we got up first? Go for it. Are you mic'd?
From here?
Yeah.
So I'm Bobby Kandaswamy with Intel Capital. So I manage our healthcare investments. Are we using slides or? Yep. Thank you. So I'll talk for a couple of minutes about Intel Capital and then go into details of our healthcare strategy and focus areas and give you a snapshot of our portfolio as well. So for those of you who don't know about Intel Capital, so we are the venture investment arm of Intel Corporation. Intel is our only LP, so basically invest out of Intel's balance sheet. Think of us as an evergreen fund. And the underlying motivation for our investments is to help grow the businesses for Intel, right? So furthering our strategic interests and by making financially attractive investments. Over the years, we've been doing this for the last 15 or 20 years almost. What's come through is the ideal investment is the intersection of strategic and financial fit. And we are a truly stage agnostic investor, go anything from a seed or a Series A all the way to mezzanine rounds and on a limited basis public companies. So what we look for in our investments basically is the same thing most others do with the addition of the strategic engagement with Intel. We particularly pay emphasis on the technology and the management teams and look at large market opportunities. The next slide sort of shows our global presence. We are truly global. More than half of our dollars go outside the US, and we've done investments in about 51 different countries to date. So this is what we did in last year and historically. So basically about $500 million, give or take, plus or minus $100 million is what we do on an annualized basis. So when you look at the traditional venture fund, in a fairly large and fairly diversified investment interests, and healthcare is one portion of this. As I mentioned, half of the deals that we've done are outside the U.S. and have had a reasonable amount of exits, IPOs, and acquisitions. So the next couple of foils will talk to you about healthcare and what are the emerging trends that we see in healthcare that aligns with our businesses. Essentially, think of Intel as in the computing and communications business, and the overlay or intersection of those two with healthcare is where our interests and opportunities lay. Some of the core trends that we believe are changing the shape of healthcare, which you've heard through the course of the day, essentially around aging. You'll see a couple of charts that show how dramatically the population will change over the next 20 to 30 years and the resulting impact on the delivery of healthcare. The move from sort of specialty solo care into collaborative care models, payment reform, which we've heard quite a bit about, moving from pay for volume to pay for value, and then the whole personalization aspect where it's not population-based studies but individualized care models, and medicine being personalized to a level where it's unique to me, not just what meets 60% of the population. And then lastly, the proactive consumers, which you heard again multiple times. So basically, we believe this is a very large vertical that can benefit out of the use of IT, and we can play a role in that. The next two charts I'll just quickly go through, but take a look at this. This is as of 2002, and about 10% of the people over 60 worldwide, 60 plus population is about 10%, right? And you fast forward to 2050, and that's a pretty dramatic change. So, all of the mature markets that we call today, US, Canada, Europe, Australia, and Japan, in purple, so more than 30% of the population is going to be above age 60. So this will require innovation in the care models and things that need to be done for providing the quality of life that everyone is looking for. So what's the role of Intel and software, right? So this chart, we put that together just to show how data is today and where the data models are moving towards. Essentially, if you look at what we have today, are islands of data with significant delay times, untagged, lots of data being collected, but not any useful interpretations being made. We see that sort of evolving into a connected data model across organizations and firewalls in real time with complex bandwidth availability, LTE or 4G being available, making real-time data and communications available. Tag data that helps you drive both decision making and analysis in real time on an individualized basis. So what's the underlying thing behind all of this data communication? Sort of three things, right? There's security, there's manageability, and then interoperability, which are all required to make this data spiral happen. And we believe there's a role for us to play here. I'll skip this chart, but essentially, take this as 4 places where Intel's actively working with all of the major players in the ecosystem. And most of the focus today is on the left 2 bars, essentially around collection of data and coordination. And the future work will have to be around support and personalization for making this happen. I'll leave you with one last slide, which is this is a snapshot of our portfolio today. A couple of the companies, and Sotera Wireless is here today, I think, on the panel. Tom Watlington is here, and a number of other companies ranging from PacBio on the medical research, molecular diagnostics side to pure healthcare IT play like Bsoft and PAC's solution out in Brazil called Pixion. So that's sort of an overview of Intel Capital. I'll pass it on to Mohit.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mo. I head up the BD and strategy group of the West Health Initiative, and we do a range of things. We innovate and incubate technologies internally. We have a policy center. We also have an external fund with 6 companies now in the portfolio, with one just real mission: how do we help lowering the cost of healthcare? So I was asked to talk about this convergence of IT and devices. So the framework, I think, is to think through what are some of the macroeconomic factors which are driving real policy change, and then these inflection points that I think are creating a whole new range of opportunities in this convergent space. Excuse me. So I'm going to whiz through this. I know I'm preaching to the converted, but the macro trends are pretty dire. We now spend close to 18% of GDP on healthcare. 75% of this is perpetuated by chronic disease, which obviously elderly people have. We have more elderly people coming into the population, and then unfortunately a relative lack of people to look after these elderly people. So reform is somewhat a reaction to this, and I believe unfortunately that reform has been poorly communicated. It's a lot more than just adding 30 million new people into the system. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this. I think the most relevant points here are the first two around the device industry. First of all is the data piece. So high tech, which was essentially the carrots and sticks to make physicians use EMRs, is really more about trying to get data into the system which hasn't been captured before. So we can really start understanding the levers to pay for outcomes versus volume, which I know that's a theme you've heard many times today. And the second piece to perpetuate that is payment model change. So for me, again, whether it's an ACO, bundled, or 30-day, all these mechanisms are trying to push risk to the provider systems. And importantly, a lot of these changes are trying to incentivize care before someone comes into hospital or after someone leaves the hospital. So there's a real shift from acute hospitals trying to become more care delivery networks. And to empower that, we need ubiquitous data communication and care coordination through that. And I feel the real opportunity for devices in this space is, first of all, devices are a mechanism to capture data, and devices are also a mechanism to push out information. But very rarely do we see devices as a solution by itself in this care coordination space. And I'll go deeper into that when I think through some of the opportunities we see emerging. So I'm now going to try to summarize some of these sort of large shifts, the market reactions, and then go specifically into key new opportunities in terms of technology and business models. So we talked about the macro state of healthcare. And then in terms of some of the market trends in reaction to this, first of all of us are now starting to pay more for our healthcare individually, again, via high deductibles, consumer-driven health plans. So we're now more incentivized to think through the best care for us, but the tools for us to do that are terrible, which is a real opportunity. And the other piece I really want to focus on, because I think is very relevant to this audience, the notion of physicians being able to do what they want to do and buy whatever device they want to buy, again, is not a viable one. So again, whether it's an ACO or new structure that emerges, we're seeing physicians becoming more likely to be salaried in nature and centralized purchasing occurring, with the cost piece being way more important than just the quality piece. So that's a very important consideration around sales forces. So the most important, again, implications I think relevant to this audience, the need for coordinated care and then how devices integrate within that. Again, if you think about chronic disease driving a lot of this, novel sensors that can pick up decompensation of say, congestive heart failure before someone becomes symptomatic so we can intervene earlier in that process is a huge opportunity. And think about COPD, pneumonia, MI, all the payment models are going towards that space. So that's a very specific opportunity for novel sensors and devices. The other piece I wanted to talk about is just the interoperability piece that Bobby talked about as well. If one has a real novel sensor, you can imagine building a solution just around that device. But if we're talking about measuring weight, blood pressure, glucose, the hierarchy of data is not so valuable in that by itself. So it's more about integrating that data into the back end, whether that's the health IT framework, the EMR. But again, there's a convergence of device people needing to speak with healthcare IT people. And then I want to go onto the Q&A. So the real themes that we see, which I think are relevant here. First of all, the analytics. So for me, it's all about the data. What are we going to do with this data? So the next generation analytics that could be applied to multi-source sensor data as well as clinical data to really show gaps in care or points around population health where we can intervene earlier. The other piece, which I think may be less relevant here, is hospital systems need to go at risk, so they need to start using the right data to manage that risk, which they didn't have under the HMO experiment. That's the real difference this time. I've talked about the novel sensing, and then just amalgamating up, there's just new care delivery processes that are emerging around whether hospitals are acquiring other pieces of it or virtual integration. So how you as industry people fit within this new configurement of industry, I think is going to be really important. So those are my brief comments. Thank you. Who's next?
which way is the play button? Well, malfunction here, wireless malfunction now. Here we go. My name is Jack Young. I'm with Qualcomm Ventures. So many of you know Qualcomm is a major global player for mobile technology, but I don't know how many of you know that today the mobile phones are so pervasive that there's people in the world have access to mobile more often than, or more accessible than clean water, electricity, and toothbrush. That's to my surprise. So what is really the mobile phone implication? Not only it's available to everybody, but there are many other attributes, which is, I believe, is a transformative to today's healthcare, especially in the personal health. So the foremost, the cell phone, it comes with a battery, right? It comes with HD display, it's internet access, it comes with local computing power, cloud computing power, and it's always with you. So what does that really mean when I say transformative? So some of you probably, when you go in the grocery store waiting for the grocery, you read the tabloids, and Tom Cruise a couple of years ago bought this ultrasound machine when Katie was first pregnant. That's $250,000, and some of you know that's not intended for home use. And well, luckily, Tom obviously donated to the community hospital, all the good cause for Tom. And the next wave, obviously, my colleague GE that is coming with a device that much more affordable and portable. But what's more important is if you look at here's a device that about to hit the market whereby you can buy a probe for merely a couple $100, and then couple that with the cell phone, which is providing 90–80% of the functionality as I described earlier. That truly become transformative. And I think Mr. Hemsley mentioned earlier about cost savings, 20–30%. How about here, from a $200,000 to a couple $100, right? So that's what we talk about transformative. And then also one of the things I want to mention, that device is always with you. That's even more a bigger disruptive than just the sheer amount of cost reduction. So again, to the same vein that I think many of you have seen this device before, a live core. So this device that first brought to the market last December, when I said first introduced to the market, this is pre-FDA, just for clarification. So what you see I'm holding here is an iPhone case, fits nicely into iPhone 4 and iPhone 4S. Last December at a USC, just like a conference like this, Dr. Leslie Sexton, many of you know, handed out the case, so-called a trial. The only criteria is that for audience who has an iPhone 4S, we handed out 52 cases, and over the 8 weeks, we have conducted a study, which is truly astonishing, right? If you look at the results here to the right, we discovered at least 3 or 4 cases which lead into hospitalization, one leading into ablation, and more dramatically, probably all of you know that Dr. Eric Topol, be on the plane when the intercom comes, there is a doctor on board. Guess what? We got a cardiologist, not only the cardiologist, but probably was best well-known cardiologist in the world, come to the back, and the dramatic fashion, he takes this thing, puts on the chest of the patient, say, yeah, let's bring the plane down. Now imagine that all happens to the 8 weeks, the average people like you and I, taking that device home in the hands of an average consumer, and these are the results we can produce. Just imagine what could happen when these devices like this hit the market and it hits everybody's hand. So not only devices that I described earlier that accessories attached to the cell phone, but today we see emergence of devices just from everywhere, from the wellness and devices. I'm sure some of you are wearing a pedometer, whether it's from white things or body media, etc. And also from a disease management perspective, you have all kinds of devices. We mentioned about Satera Wireless here and many others, Dexcom, etc. So we have basically devices and sensors can monitor you from all disease states, from your head to toe, from your birth to cradle point. I think my colleague Mo mentioned earlier, so you got all this data, what are you going to do with that, right? So the key thing is obviously how do you aggregate this data together, and more importantly, once you aggregate data, how do you apply informatics? In Qualcomm, we are certainly leading the charge here, providing a platform that if you are interested, I'll be happy to share with you. The 2NET platform allows all this discrete sensor to be aggregated into a secure fashion and provide analytics to that. At Qualcomm, even though we are pretty new to these conferences, I bet you I'm probably the first one speaking in this conference, but we're not new to the wireless health system. We actually helping to drive many initiatives. that starting from 8-9 years ago, we have done a number of initiatives and conferences, research. We're also very tight with the West Foundation here that along with that, we have an investment fund, and which is the Qualcomm Ventures itself has been there since year 2000, but a new fund, Qualcomm Life Fund, was carved out last December, and it's a $100 million allocation to specifically accelerate the wireless health initiative. Soteria Wireless is one of the investments we have met before the formation of the fund, but we have lumped into that. And today you have seen we have boosted a 6th investment, and you will see more announcement coming from our fund in the next couple of months. So thank you.
If they're ready yet. So good afternoon. I'm Mark Holroyd. I'm with GE's Healthy Imagination Fund. One of the senior members of the team, and was involved with the initial launch of this back in 2009. So obviously we approach this topic and very much from the perspective of a very traditional Medtech type of company, but a lot of what I hear from my colleagues up on the panel are very consistent with the thoughts that we have. I just wanted to run quickly through a couple slides on the fund, and then hurry into the discussion, because I think that's what will be most interesting for the audience here. But we have, like others on the panel, have started our own investing activity in healthcare, and it's really just we've because of what we see, the breadth of healthcare that we're involved in, obviously just a lot of natural deals and opportunities come our way. And we decided to organize this a few years back. We put a nominal allocation of capital, $250 million, toward this effort, to really commit money to grow promising healthcare technology companies. And we work with entrepreneurs, with existing VCs, and we're really trying to foster development and the commercial success of these technologies. We're a little bit unique in that GE is a conglomerate. We have lots of different resources and capabilities, and the fund draws on really 3 big pools of talent within GE. We have the industrial business on GE Healthcare. We have GE Capital, which is a very experienced investor in its own right in private equity. And then we have this organization we call Global Research Center, which is essentially 3,000 scientists running around globally, doing a lot of basic research, and the depth of expertise is pretty. It's really an embarrassment of riches. So this effort was put together in 2009. We launched it as part of Jeff Immelt's Healthy Imagination Initiative. We have a lot of senior level engagement and support, and we're very fortunate to have this. So quickly, the guidelines, I'm probably very familiar with to many of you. We look for the same things that a lot of VCs will look for. Fundamentally, just a good, strong market opportunity, business model, and technology with really strong value proposition. Typically, we're a minority investor. We won't take more than 20% ownership in any given opportunity. Our initial checks are going to be up to $5 million. We often reserve for multiples of that. Our model is to invest from the first round through exit. We typically like to be involved with the governance of a company. It really varies on what we think we can bring to the table. Obviously, we like to see strong management in place. When we think about what our portfolio is going to look like, about a third we'll classify kind of as early venture. A third will be transactions that have some strategic element to the GE businesses, and then maybe another third will be what we call late stage growth equity. So where are we focused on? What kinds of things interest us and excite us, and why were we asked to come on the panel? I think we kind of simplify the world. First of all, if you look at healthcare, it's a huge industry. If you took out pharmaceuticals and those therapeutics and a lot of the big service businesses like running hospitals, those are kind of out of scope for us. Everything else is fair game for our team. And we've kind of divided up the world into monitoring, navigation, kind of traditional Medtech devices, high-value diagnostics. We say healthcare IT, but we don't really look at it, I think, the way traditional IT investors would look at it. We kind of see healthcare IT as an overarching theme, and then of course life sciences. So one of the things that we see again and again in the opportunities we come across and the discussions we have with entrepreneurs and frankly our own GMs is this theme of pervasive big data. And we've been in the Medtech business on the industrial side for years and have a huge install base, sell literally thousands of products in the hospital and institutional channels. And we spit a ton of data back to physicians. And I think the easy part really is pulling the parameters out. The difficult part is turning all those parameters into meaningful, clinically relevant information for the physician to make timely decisions for the patients they're caring for. And I think the challenge, when you talk about convergence of IT and MedTech, the challenge really is, in many markets, the device that pulls the parameter is going to become, if it hasn't already, be quickly commoditized. The IP lasts only so long, and then pretty soon, it's being made in China and for a fraction of the cost. So the real value to what we see to the customers, both patients, hospitals, and physicians, is how do you take all of this disparate information, take out all the false, all the noise, the false alarms that lead to clinically irrelevant action, and add cost to the system, and create information that actually helps guide the care path for the physician. So combining multiple parameters so that you have an intelligent read on the patient's health and where they're at. So this has been and will continue to be a very big area of focus for us. And we have a very strong base of resources from which to draw. And I think we've seen lots of things together. And I've worked with both of your institutions on other things, and I'm sure we're going to see a lot more together. Just a couple of quick more slides. All these things, again, are in scope for the fund. We label it broad-based diagnostics, which includes traditional imaging diagnostics as well as in vivo diagnostic technologies. Same thing with life sciences. So we do not lack for things to do, and I think we're also very fortunate. And for us, it's never a capital issue, even though we've kind of earmarked $250 million. I mean, the company has $90 billion in cash, so we're definitely not capital starved. We really are. I think it's the attractive opportunities in finding those right places to plant those, plant those seeds is really where we spend most of our time.
Thank you to the whole group. So that kind of gives us the basis, but if you noticed, we're talking about what the issues are, not what the answers are. And so maybe we can, I think what we are, part of it is we're early to this. I also think that you guys are at the vanguard of understanding that this is going to be a big deal, and that's why you're at this session and want to find out a little bit more. But to make it interactive, to do what we said we were going to do. Questions? And do I have a roving mic out here someplace? Ask me the one you wanted to ask Steve Hemsley but didn't. All right, so while you're gathering that ability, can I have the mic, please? I'm going to walk out here and ask you the questions, but in the meantime, to keep this moving, is GE, do you have an example, something you can share with the audience where you've changed how you're analyzing the data? I think what we're getting a sense of is today we've got more and more data, and you said it, but it's the gathering is the easy part, it's the packaging effectively in a value-based way, et cetera, is the hard part. Have you made movement in the last 3-4 years where that you can share with us where you say, yeah, here's how this is working, and here's how technology helped us?
I'll approach that from maybe a more organizational story of some change within GE. It used to be that a lot of the care groups that touched the hospital, so the folks that sold anesthesia or ventilation machines, were a separate group than those that did all of the patient parameters. And so cardiac output, SpO2, all those things. And recently, I think partly driven by this concept of, how do we aggregate data across care units and not across products? Recently, those businesses were merged. And I think the idea is not to so much take a look at things through a product perspective, but turn that around and look at it from a care perspective. So if I'm selling multiple products to an ICU, then it should be packaged as such. And on top of that, the hard piece that we're trying to figure out still is the data, is the big data question. I think if you talk to clinicians today in the hospital, nursing staffs, ICU professionals, one of their biggest complaints is false alarms. I think a lot of folks have alarmed their systems to such a degree that it's almost become irrelevant to the physicians. And an alarm going off in an ICU setting almost is a non-event. And so these are the challenges I think GE is trying to address. And technology is obviously playing a big part of that.
So part of what we want to look at is the buzzword of the year, and that is the cloud. What are we going to do with the cloud? And all the information can go to the cloud. And if we could just figure out what was in the cloud and how to download it individually, packaged, et cetera, like we've been talking, that would work. If you're doing that, does anybody want to address how you get around privacy, how you get around HIPAA, how you can make that work in a healthcare way so that you're not just sharing photos or music, but you're actually sharing your personal healthcare data, which could be used against you if the bad guys got it?
Maybe I'll just add from our perspective, I mentioned earlier that obviously in the home setting and the personal setting depends on the applications, whether it's wellness and fitness or disease management, the privacy, and obviously it's a little bit different. But one of the things that we have done is to ease of that data collection parts, we leverage the core sets of Qualcomm using cellular technology to provide the experience that the out-of-the-box experience, right? You're talking about people who are sick in transition care. The last thing you want to know is you ask them, what is your internet address or MAC address? So typically what we have done is we come up with a product services which allow this device to be plugged into the wall and automatically turns on the internet through a cellular, and then automatically discover the devices that are medical to your health and medical related, whether it's your blood pressure or weight scales and whatnot, and all the data will be safeguarded through a HIPAA compliant data connectivity to a secure cloud, and from there we can disperse to wherever needed, back to the patient, to the carers and patients. So we basically try to facilitate that, instead of each individual components to deal with that, we try to provide the aggregated pipe. So that's one aspect at least.
Yeah, and let me take a go. So there are now HIPAA compliant clouds as an example, and what I think the question was addressing public clouds. Again, a lot of the healthcare systems we've seen have adopted hybrid models, so there's a private partition for their very sensitive data in a very HIPAA compliant way, and then scale around the public cloud. So I don't see it as a huge issue. I think with the right regulation and technology, we can solve it. So
now you've got a cloud and it's HIPAA compliant and it's private, but is there then room to analyze those data?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right.
So maybe if I can add to that, there's two aspects to it, right? One is the aggregation of data and making interpretations out of data that's available on an aggregate scale, not on an individual basis. But for data stored specific to an individual within the cloud, I think there's enough security in place today. Even in the multi-tenant model that Nemo was talking about, public clouds, there's enough for disaggregation and separation where individual information can be separated and protected, right? If you think about the financial sector where significant amounts of data is flying through all the time, you have similar regulatory and compliance issues, and it's the same thing. I think the healthcare industry is a little bit slower to adopt versus the financial sector being an early adopter.
Another question that came in is then, for those of you who've made investments either internally or externally into some of these companies that you showed up on your slides, are there any examples, are there any new commercial equations that we can talk about as far as data and analysis of data where you get paid? And if so, who's paying for it?
Yeah, so maybe I can start with, I demonstrated this devices earlier. This is still in very early stage. It's going to go through FDA. So speaking about this device itself, it's a device as well as the services. So with a simple iPhone case here that I can acquire a single lead ECG. Now, the ECG to most of the consumers is meaningless, right? So what do we do here? So the idea is that to have this data to be, once you collected it, thanks to the cell phone, automatic sent to the cloud, and there's a machine. Obviously, GE has a very sophisticated machine. They can tell you, maybe you have a symptom, and maybe you should go see a doctor. Or in some cases, that services can be provided whereby if there is an anomaly, machine detected can prompt to the doctor right away. So there's devices today. What I think is more and more, just about everybody I talk to, is how do we connect the data in real time? How do I send to the cloud to do the machine pass and then human intervention that provides that kind of a service?
Who buys that? Does the individual buy that for their own health? Does the wife buy it for the husband? Who buys it?
That's obviously, I believe there's a myriad of the scenarios that whereby potentially a disease management company or a payer will be able to provide that care or service to their members. Or in other cases, many cases, we believe the consumer are able to do that because I mentioned earlier, this is a magnitude of cost reduction and convenience to anybody, right? So in the past, if you want to do ECG, you can buy one of those devices, $300, and you have to use the cables, whatnot. Here, we make this thing affordable, consumer grade, less than $100 in your pocket. You don't have to worry about charging anything. Anytime you don't feel discomfort, you can measure that. So I think that prompts the model for consumer to pay for that. And if you can pay for your loved one as well, I can see potentially, your parents.
Yeah, Airstrip, though, is another good example of that more in an institutional setting, where that's, it's not a consumer model, but it's a pay-per-use, it's a subscription in some cases with institutions. So I think there are examples of investments that have been made, to try and monetize maybe in a more traditional IT business model within healthcare.
I just add to that, and not to steal too much of Tom's thunder later on about Sotera, but they're a classic example of how the methods of measurements are changing, right? One of the innovations that the company has is continuous blood pressure monitoring. I mean, unheard of outside the ICU today, but their product can enable that in any setting, eventually in the home. So you take that data, you got the data coming through continuously over a period of time, where and you folks, some of your experts here, can imagine what benefit you can have, understanding trends before any catastrophic event could happen, and as a result, people either paying the same amount of money or paying extra for that kind of work that'll help improve decision making and response to the customer.
So maybe I add one point to that. About these consumer model, one of the things that we'll be very careful is, I think the previous speaker speaking about that, it's the cost benefit, right? So you talk about the hospitals or anybody is not going to adapt a new solution unless you can achieve 20, 30% times the savings. And I'm talking about magnitude of changing of the cost. So here we have to be very careful to figure out the business model, especially in the reimbursed model. Lots of business models have failed because they forgot it's a reverse economy, right? The insurance is only paid certain amount. If you have innovation and technology, increase the cost. So how can you be competitive in the market? You have to offset the other ways. So there is tons of examples we can show within that confinement of a reimbursement. How to be more innovative to get other benefits out of the system.
The other thing, we've talked about payment, and the other part that makes Medtech a little bit different is the regulatory, and if we stick with the US model, that would be the FDA. There was a recent FDA device panel meeting for a internal implanted diagnostic, if you will, for cardiac health that would put the data out, company was CardioMEMS, that would put the data out, the doctors would analyze it and change their therapy, their prescriptions. Control group and the variable group did better. The panel had some issues, as did the FDA, with the protocol for the clinical trial. Not so much with the device, with the protocol at the trial. But every doctor on the panel said they wish they had this device tomorrow. When you guys are looking at these things, do you look at the FDA? I mean, you're used to IT, you're used to getting these things out fairly quickly. Do you look at things differently, knowing that you have to go through the FDA?
So we're learning, right? For us, going into healthcare was new. Intel started their healthcare initiative, which now is part of which is outside the home, and this is a joint venture with GE called Care Innovations. But it was definitely a learning experience, right? Not used to the regulatory requirements, not fully familiar with what people in the med device industry, for example, know the details of class 1 or class 3 or a PMA, etc. We've learned and understood what the process is from an investment standpoint. As we evaluate opportunities, it becomes a key criteria, both in terms of time to market, how long will these things take to meet those regulatory requirements, things outside of a control that could delay product launch. And then on the other side, the cost, right? So as a VC going into an investment, you look for what's the amount of funding required to profitability and eventually exit, and having adequate reserves, not just yourself, but along with your syndicate of investors, how to bring that to bear.
Yes, I actually think the challenge is when devices are now becoming part of a network solution. So one can imagine a defibrillator linked to an EMR with analytics living in the cloud, mingling the defibrillator data with medication compliance data. And that's a very hard scenario, I think, for the FDA, because you have a class 3 device now being part of an end-to-end solution with other pieces which maybe have less risk, but then do you now start regulating the whole end-to-end in terms of risk? And that hasn't been figured out as yet, but I think that's a big challenge we have to get through.
But the meetings have started, so the FDA has to rise up, as do the other components.
Absolutely.
We've used up our time, and I just want to not only thank the panelists and their knowledge and sharing some of that knowledge with us, but also I want to tie back to Stephen Hemsley and one of the things he said right at the end, because there's a lot of financial people in the audience, and my ears perked up when he said this. He pays out $150 billion a year, and 15% of that is performance-based today, and 25% is going to be performance-based in the next few years. So I'm doing the math there, right? We've got $22.5 billion that he's spending on performance-based, and he's going to go to 37.5, so we get an extra $15 billion onto that already large market over the next few years. That perks my ears up. What does performance-based mean? How's he going to measure it? How is he going to gather that over all of the patients and touch points that he has to do that? And that's just one insurance company. So from an opportunity standpoint, it sure seems to me like these kinds of technology things have got a big ramp in front of them. So with that, thank you, gentlemen, very much. Appreciate it.